So, look, we might start. Thank you all very much for coming. This is the second in the Ecology and Environment Special Interest Group webinar series and experiment to see how it works. I'd like to acknowledge the planet we're on and acknowledge that it's the provider of all things that we need for a living. And I also wish to acknowledge all the countries of all the peoples, the Indigenous peoples that we are on around Australia. So today I'm going to very quickly take us through this idea of a sustainable population for Australia. The Public Health Association has a policy which was up for review this year, but we've asked them very nicely to move it over to next year so we can go through this process. And I think it's become evident that a sustainable or population discussion is both topical and controversial and it becomes more controversial when it gets linked to the idea of control of population. And it's topical because it's been in the news, and even the Liberal National Party government has a Minister for Cities, Urban Infrastructure and Population. And they've picked up on the fact that 2 decades of not spending on infrastructure while Australia has had record immigration levels has left our biggest cities, Sydney and Melbourne, which are much less livable. So Alan Tudge, that Minister for Cities and Population, has flagged the need to start to build the infrastructure in advance of the people coming. But he hasn't worried about the people coming. But they miss the point that it's not just about infrastructure or traffic congestion, crowded beaches, or even the rate of population increase, as Gladys Berejiklian is worried about in Sydney. It's a controversial topic because the biggest driver of Australian population change is in fact immigration, or more accurately, net overseas migration. And there's a very reality-based fear within progressive circles that talking about information opens us up to attacks being racist, which promptly derails the conversation. So, to be really clear up front, this is not about stopping boats or Muslims or people of colour, and INPHA strongly supports all the United Nations statements over the past decades about the right to free migration between countries. But while a conversation about migration is necessary, it needs to be framed in a particular way. And so while we mention an ecological perspective in the current PHAA policy, I think that we need to become a lot more pointed about that perspective. So in the current policy, we define an ecologically sustainable population as an optimal level for the planet. We talk about living within the ecological boundaries, or the planetary boundaries in the new jargon. We talk about environmental and social justice, and we talk about the need to strive for optimal levels of health and well-being. And so that's the framing that we approach this, the value statement underlying this policy. So this introduces the idea of a socio-ecological, or as it's more modernly called, an eco-social approach, which is framed, it's got about a 20-year whakapapa working through various, can't think of the word, but it's manifest in eco-health, One Health, human ecology, and then most recently is the idea of planetary health. But within this approach, we've got human ecology, which is, if you like, the study of humans in their environment. And it's got, according to Rob Diebold and Barry Newell, these 4 elements around the social ecological interactions, it's about cultural systems and the world views, these things drive learning and behaviour change. And within at least the Australian brand of human ecology, it talks very strongly about having an ethical priority or an ethical lens to look at these systems through. But the key thing is it's humans living in their environment and living within their cultural worldviews, which puts a particular framing on it that we'll come back to at the end. So historically, the human relationship with the ecosystem, at least in Europe and probably the Middle East, has been based on the biblical command of go forth and multiply. The earth is a blank slate. We can just get out there and reap and sow and pillage. Over perhaps the last 30 years or so, more and more people have become to think that actually it was probably more like 100 years, 150 years. People have become aware that this isn't actually working. And people have started to think about different ways of thinking about human impacts on the environment. Paul Ehrlich and, forget his name, Holdren, proposed about 20 to 30 years ago this idea that human impact is a function of population, consumption, and what they called a technological factor. And they came up with this I is a function of PAT, or I equals PAT thing that gets, or equation that gets thrown around. If we open this up a bit, and Diebold and Newell do this in their book Human Ecology, a primer, they introduce the idea of different sorts of consumption, and then I've also introduced the concept of waste. And I think by teasing the I equals PAT equation out to the one that you can see on your screen, it allows us to think that it's both about population, about basic consumption, which is the idea that everybody on the planet should have, excuse me, a basic level of income, if you like, of resources and energy to live comfortably. And then there's discretionary consumption, which you can do over and above that. And I'm going to cough again. And the technological factor. And I think it's important to put waste in there as well, because as we'll see in a moment, waste has some feedbacks into the system that we need to be thinking about. But I think the lesson from Ehrlich and Holdren's work is that population is one factor, but all the factors are important, and we can adjust different factors. And so we can't say there is an optimal population for either planet Earth or any particular bioregion in planet Earth. What we can say is that the population that the planet will carry depends on the level of consumption. It depends on what technology we have access to, and it depends on the level of waste. So this brings in the idea of carrying capacity, which basically is the number of species that you can support in a local ecosystem. Now I'll give you a moment to look at that while I cough some more. So what Diebold and Newell did is they took that function that we had on the previous slide and unpacked it into a stock and flow diagram. The interesting thing around a stock and flow diagram is it allows you to think about stocks, that is the level of human population, the level of essential resources, the level of waste, and the flows then depict the filling up or the emptying of those stocks. And then it allows you to create an influence diagram so you can look at what what are the factors that influence those flows, which in turn influence the level of the stocks. And so the other part of their thing is by bringing in carrying capacity, that allows us to look, I don't know if I wiggle the mouse, that makes sense. This idea of the carrying capacity population gap, and that becomes a modulator of population change. So the key element of this diagram is the population change. That is what feeds either into increasing the level of human population or a reduction in human population if it falls, or metaphorically the flow goes the other way. That is, death rates exceed birth rates. The other important part of this is this idea of level of essential resources. And at least for renewable resources, you get an inflow. Non-renewable resources like phosphorus and sand, once we've run out of them, we've run out of them, and that's it. They flow out. So just unpacking this a bit, of course, the level of human population itself is a driver of human population. The more people, the more babies. The level of human population also drives the level of consumption. So the more people, the more consumption. Consumption drives resource use. But because we're humans, we have this technological factor. We can be more efficient at how we use resources, so we can carry a larger level of population for a given set of resources. Or we can use those spare, if you like, resources to raise the level of the human population, which then comes back to driving the resource use. How much waste we generate also depends on technological factors. And of course, the amount of resource consumption drives the amount of waste. Waste, through various feedback mechanisms, drives resource renewal, and it also drives population change. If we think about chemicals in the environment, particularly endocrine disrupting chemicals in the environment, then that's going to affect the ability of humans to have babies. The other important part that I've added to this is the idea of we need to put other species resource use into this function as well, because of course they are also using resources, and it's a balance. If we're using the resources, there's less resource for other species, which is the way it's going at the moment. But it's important to think about other species' needs for resources in this as well. And of course, carrying capacity is totally dependent on the level of essential resources. Agronomists back in the 19th century came up with this entity called the law of the minimum, which basically says that the carrying capacity of an ecosystem is dependent on the least available resource. And in fact, Thomas Malthus, when he did his work on human population, took food as the essential resource and did his modelling based on the fact that if we run out of food, we're going to run out of the capacity for people to live in the numbers that they were living in England at the time. Now, he forgot the technological impact factor of the Industrial Revolution and the sudden access to fossil fuels, but he had the theory right. The interesting thing, coming back to the carrying capacity population gap, is that it's the size of that gap that drives population change. So as the carrying capacity approaches the capacity for the population that exists at the moment, that has an inhibitory feedback on population change. Now, in this system, there's a delay, there's a lag in that cycle. So it might be several decades between that gap going to zero or going negative before it will have a population change. And therefore, there is the very real likelihood of overshoot scenarios where we have overshoot and then a minimal population decline. But of course, if we overshoot significantly enough, we might well have a population crash. So any questions on that so far? No, great, all right. So the key thing here, I think, is that this is a flexible and dynamic relationship. And again, it emphasises that the population is only one of several factors that are going on that influence population change, which influence the level of resources, which influence the carrying capacity of the planet or the bioregion. So it puts, I think, in terms of our conversation, in terms of our policy, it puts population very much not centre stage, but it puts population centre stage, and it allows us to talk about population change rather than the level of population and how these factors influence that. But it does allow us to bring up the overshoot and contraction, or the overshoot and collapse scenarios, which is really the thing that we're worried about. So this section has outlined the idea of carrying capacity, and I'm hoping that it will therefore be educative to politicians and parliamentarians and the general public and the people who use our policy to help them understand a more ecological viewpoint when we start to make the conversation. But what's arising from this model, or what's not in this level of the model, is the idea of the cultural, the worldview, and the behavioural aspects of the conversation, which I'll bring out in a minute. In the meantime, this is just a quick revision of that function that we had earlier, putting human carrying capacity in as the key output variable and adding in the variables we had before, as well as the other species variable. Just a bit of like playing around here. Okay, so this is a new model. Again, we have population change in the centre, and based on the way that demographers seem to talk about population change, they talk about birth rates and death rates and net migration, which I've split here into immigration, that is people leaving the country. People clearly don't leave the planet except by dying. And immigration, so we're really talking in terms of Australia or a particular country or bioregion in terms of population change. So I'll just give you a few more moments to follow all the arrows and see where it all goes. I don't think I've included all possible factors, but I think we've probably caught the main ones, but it is quite possible I have totally omitted something really important. So feedback on that would be important. So if we start thinking about death rates, this is perhaps the least controversial part of this model. People die. How people die depends a bit on public health services and clinical health services, but also on aged care policy. So how well do we look after our old people? Birth rates, again, pretty straightforward. There is a natural fertility rate. Australia's natural fertility rate is 1.9 babies per lifetime per 1,000 mothers. which is below the replacement rate, which is internationally considered to be 2.1. But there are these host of factors which impinge on the birth rate. So, you know, cultural factors, which includes religion, social norms, you know, how many babies do your family and your friends have? Education levels, we know that the more educated and the higher paid women are, the fewer children they have. And slightly separate to that, the economic situation, which is a complex little box which I haven't unpacked here, but it depends a bit on whether your economic situation puts you into what Edward Sloan Wilson calls the live fast, die young mode, where you have lots of children early, or the alternative, which I've forgotten, which is where you have children later and you have fewer children, which is the situation in a lot of Western Europe at the moment. Then there's immigration. And for Australia, immigration is in fact the biggest driver of population change that we have. It far exceeds emigration, people leaving, and we'll unpack some of this in a moment. I've put tourism in there because we came up with some statistics or some numbers that showed that there are about 750,000 tourists in Australia at any one time, which about equals the 750,000 Australians who are overseas touristing somewhere else. But it's not a net zero effect, because we need to be providing infrastructure and using resources and energy for the tourists that are here over and above the Australians that have left. But again, we're not going to unpack that particularly much today. If we come back to immigration, then there are some drivers of immigration independent to people just wanting to freely migrate to Australia because, you know, they'd like to come and live here. There are a whole set of push factors, if you like, that are pushing people to want to seek either humanitarian refugee immigration or other forms of immigration into Australia. And we'll look at some of these numbers in a moment. But clearly, Australians, or all countries in the world's policies around global warming and environmental change are driving these things. And also, which people tend to forget, our overseas development aid is also driving what happens in these spaces. The critical thing here, I think, is that large segments of this are in fact dependent on government policy. And I think one of the important messages here is that we are already, or we already have government policy on this, we're already making policy decisions. And therefore, I think because we're already actively making policy decisions in this place, bringing in that the ecological part of the eco-social conversation can help inform better decision-making around government policy in all these areas, which affect population change, which affect our impact on the environment. So, just as a little bit of an aside, the most recent net overseas migration figures for Australia are 2016-17. This is by looking at visa type, which is the way Australian Bureau of Statistics does it. Temporary visas, permanent visas, Aussies and New Zealanders coming back and forth, and a small, tiny smattering of other people. So we've got people coming in, people going out, and this box shows us the net gains or losses. So in terms of temporary visas, well over almost half of our migration, our net migration, overseas migration, is people who come to study, either at high school or university, and a fraction of that, people who come for temporary work under the old 457 visa. Again, net is about 77, well, at least in this financial year, there were about 77,900 extra people, which is just under a third of all our net overseas migration were overseas visitors or backpackers here on working holidays. I haven't unpacked other, but there were fewer of them. There were more of them leaving than coming last year. So about 70% of our net migration is in fact temporary or on temporary visas. Now, there is an unpacked and difficult bit of calculation here about how many of those people then apply for resident status, and I haven't got the numbers on that. But the colleague, I'm working on this with a colleague called Bagya Kutalanga, who is looking at some of these things, and she was hoping to join us tonight from India, but doesn't, or Sri Lanka actually, but doesn't look like she's been able to make the connection from Sri Lanka work. If we look at permanent visas, so these are people who are moving to Australia. There's not that many of them, but in the last few years, and I don't have a slide for this, but in the last few years, we've gone from around a third of this number to that number who are now staying. So immigration levels have gone up, but again, difficult to track this number because this is the number that ABS monitors overall, and that's gone up from between sort of 70 and 80,000 people per year back in the 1980s and the 1990s to gradual increase during the 1990s and early 2000s up to well over 300,000 people, and has now sort of settled back down around this number. So again, most of them are temporary, but about a third of them are permanently staying in Australia, and this is what's driving Australia's population growth. So family reunion, not very much. Skilled migration, a bit. Humanitarian or special needs individuals, again, not very much, about 9%, same as family reunion. But these are people, the people who are coming with the intention of staying. Now, again, it's not clear to me how many of these people go on to seek permanent residency status. That would also be an important point. So, to wrap up here, I think it was interesting while I was sitting here thinking about this today, because I think I've talked myself into the position that maybe population isn't that important. Maybe it's important that we have a population policy because we need to be talking about numbers, because ultimately, if you get to the point where you've got perfect technology, zero waste or absolute minimal waste, everybody's got a very basic level of consumption that is helping them to live well, happy and fruitful lives, then population is still important because it becomes the only driver of human impact on the planet. If the numbers go too high, then clearly we exceed carrying capacity and there will be consequences. So, but that said, population is just one of these factors that we need to be having policy about. We need to be having a policy about consumption, maybe. We need to be having a policy about limits to growth and planetary boundaries, which we do have. And together we have this little suite of policies that are part of the ecologically sustainable human society policy. But I think in the review that we're up to be doing in the next 12 months, is in the lead into the 2019 policy situation, I think we need to think this through so that we have maybe one big policy or maybe 3 or 4 little policies, but that's sort of what's open for discussion later on this evening. Back to this presentation, I think it's a dynamic population change. There are feedback loops. There are social influences. We are already making policy choices about how much people there are in Australia, and we're making those policy choices in the absence of any information or even discussion about carrying capacity. And we need to put this into our revised policy. Now, this gets really thorny because at some point, we might have to say, well, you know, the planet's full up with people. What are the implications of that? How do we manage that situation? But on a regional nation-state level, we might also have to think about how we say, well, actually, Australia's full up. It might be the size of Europe or the United States, which have got 500 million people each. But given that 80% of the Australian continent is arid, we don't have the same carrying capacity that Europe or North America or South America have. And so how do we know when enough is enough? How do we know when we have enough people? Because we can invite, you know, continue to invite people in at the rate that we're inviting people in. We continue to overcrowd our cities. We can continue to do that. We can, even if we're building infrastructure at a massive rate, eventually we won't have the food and the water reserves to feed these people or to keep these people in a fit state. If our ecosystem collapses, that may be fair on one level if we think about what's happening to the ecosystem, say, in India. On the other hand, does it really help anybody on the planet? So there's some interesting questions which I've just skirted around here and only mentioned. So let's wind it up there. And see if I can work out how to stop sharing. There we are. Okay. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Can I just, sorry, I had a question which I thought about before when you were talking, I suppose it's particularly about carrying capacity and thinking being an environmental SIG, even though it's obviously with a thing for humans, but would you also have to then include the carrying capacity for the animals and other animals, insects, whatever? I mean, I was thinking, you know, like people talking about bees, and if you don't have bees, you can't, you know, there goes the whole sort of collapse of civilization sort of thing, at least certainly for food and, you know, pollination. And so, or, you know, where people are building things and they're tearing down natural habitats for koalas or other, you know, etc. So I'm just thinking of Australia. So in terms of population, should that somehow be factored in? I mean, I know you mentioned the needs of other species and things, and I suppose that sort of resources comes in there. I mean, but does that sort of cover, I don't know, all of it, or should there be something in there about when, you know, you're considering this, you have to consider the population and not just maybe nice fluffy koalas, but things like bees or even, I don't know, mosquitoes and flies and
Slugs.
Slugs, yeah, you know, in terms of their carrying capacity and that, you know, yes, sort of what's actually needed to be able to have, for people to even have, you know, at least a basic comfortable life sort of thing, forgetting about what you're going to consider that as. But yeah. I mean, is that something that sort of needs to be, I don't know, highlighted, especially because when people talk about, you know, extinctions and things, you know, that's, I suppose.
And biodiversity protection and all those essential things. I mean, I think that there's two takes on this. One is the ethical, philosophical take that says other species have as much right to have a comfortable existence on this planet as our species does, and therefore we should, as the sentient species on the planet, be actively taking that into account. And then there's, if you like, the instrumentalist viewpoint or the enlightened self-interest viewpoint that says if we destroy all these other species in the ecosystem, then we're actually trashing the ecosystem and undermining the ecosystem's capacity to provision and support our civilization. That's sort of the planetary health take on it. So you're right. And whether just having the needs of other species in there is a strong enough statement, or whether we need to make it a stronger statement is a good question.
It seems, this is Jill, so it seems to me that both those arguments are pretty important and, you know, both have weight. So
Yeah.
one, the ethical point of view, and two, humans can't survive without it anyway. So, and not only animals, but also plants. So I've been a bit involved recently in some stuff about plants and climate change and what might happen. No plants, no life is basic premise, I think.
Yep.
So, I think they're both important arguments myself.
Yep.
And they should definitely be in there. I was going to ask about, in your original equation, where
Yep.
you had the other species in there, so we had sort of the impact depending on population, basic consumption, discretionary consumption, I think was next.
Yep.
Anyway, at the end was, and then technology was in there, and at the end was other species.
Yep.
But it sort of sounded a bit like that was, you know, they were needing resources, or we could take the resources. But I don't think it's quite as simple as that, is it? There's an
Well, I think
interdependence going on there.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess it looked like that because human carrying capacity is partially dependent on leaving enough resources there for these other species, and so we do have to factor those other species' needs into our carrying capacity. I mean, I haven't done a whole lot of reading around carrying capacity, other than enough to know that nobody's really figured out how to measure it properly. I mean, on the global level, they do talk about the footprint or the number of planets that we need to have. That's sort of one way of modelling this idea of carrying capacity. And currently, we are exceeding the planet's carrying capacity by some factor of, you know, 1, well, 2 or 5, depending how you count it. But again, that's an illustration. If we all lived like North Americans, then we're going to need 5 planets. If we all lived like Sinhalese, we probably would squeak by on the planet we've got.
Yeah.
And I suppose also for animals and plants, I mean, they need to have enough carrying capacity, because you can't have them just like people, you know, they've got to have biodiversity if they're to grow and, you know, populate, that they're not, you know, when they talk about, oh, we're up down to the last 5 of something or other, you can't really breed from 5 the same ones, you know, they sort of, that sort of carrying capacity in terms of making sure that the biodiversity isn't just that they're just eking out whatever, whether it's planned or not, but there's, you know, they actually do have sort of diversity, and you know, the genetic pool isn't shrunk to some, you know, impossible level, whatever it is, depending on, I suppose, on what it is you're particularly talking about.
Yeah. So in a way, it's, I'm just writing down here, loss of other species carrying capacity is theft.
I've got a question. When you talk about net overseas migration, you point to permanent migrants, but in fact temporary migrants are here too, and if they're replaced by other temporary migrants, the fact of it being a person existing in Australia is permanent, irrespective of the individual changing. So we can't just ignore them because they're not permanent, because they're just going to be replaced by someone else. So it doesn't matter whether the individual is permanent or not. That number, if we're talking about numbers, is what is increasing consumption in Australia.
True, yes.
Thank you.
That sounds very real to me.
Yeah, that sounds very good. And the fact that I suppose tourists also need things that, even though you might think, I don't know, are different or extra, perhaps to even people coming in on a temporary visa. Because if you're coming in on a maybe temporary visa and working somewhere, even like when I went to Samoa and sort of lived there for 18 months, well, I stayed in one spot, you know, and then went out and did things, but I had, you know, rented a place. But here, you know, if you're a tourist, you might be here and you might be there. And, you know, so you did need different things, and some might be better set up, you know, a big city might be better set up for tourists, you know, when they turn up than small country towns, and then suddenly, or they have them only for one weekend, and then what happens after that sort of thing, because that's their big event. So I suppose there's also those sort of things, you know, what's required by the different people. And like you said, yes, there's temporary people coming in, and if they just get replaced or the next lot comes in, and someone might come in, and I suppose I don't know if that just counts the number of visas. So you don't know if that's, you know, people coming in with a temporary thing might bring their family, or some might come in as a single person. So I don't know if those numbers include sort of everybody who comes in under that, if they all come in then under that visa, even if they're not actually working because they're the kids, or whether it's just the people who are actually doing the working or something.
I would assume
Question.
everybody, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would think so. So a family of 4 would count as 4.
Yeah. That's what I'd assume, that I don't really know that.
Yeah. Because, I mean, they would all have to have visas that would all be linked to that person. So even if somebody comes on a 457 visa and they've got a wife and a kid, they would also have some sort of visa that would link them so they could be here. And I think, I mean, the issue of tourists, when we thought this through, and I think this does apply to the temporary migrants, is that they actually need, it's not like, you know, 70 Australians go overseas and 70 tourists come in, because the Australians that have left have still got their house and their car and their job and their infrastructure. And so that's not being used by the tourists that have come, that their resource and energy needs are, well, maybe not the energy needs, that might balance out, but the resource needs in terms of accommodation for them. But then they've also got extra transport needs, and they have actually a much bigger
big
accommodation need, because, you know, they might need a hotel room in Sydney for a couple of nights, a hotel room in Alice Springs for a few nights, a hotel room at Ayers Rock for a couple of nights.
To say nothing of getting there, like you mentioned the transport,
Yeah.
but I thought that was a big part of it.
Yeah, and a lot of them, actually, I don't know how many would travel by air. Obviously, a class travel by air, a class travel by bus, and some people travel some places by train when that's possible.
And then the people who hire, you know, buy the second-hand van, car, etc., and travel around, and then, you know, sell it at the end. Yeah, no, that's what I was meaning by the tourists, you know, that they're going to have needs because they're not just in one spot for most of the time, generally, unless they were really here for a really short visit for some reason. But yes, I mean, they could be there for months and, you know, going to a lot of different places. No.
Does anybody think that there could be a role for a advocacy for some sort of progression here? So we talk a lot about immigrants and tourists, which is very contemporary, but actually as we move towards the thoughts of planetary health and One Health and everybody being as a whole as a planet, should we be starting to try and move the focus towards the idea of people being earthlings rather than you're somebody from abroad who's moving to Australia, and actually starting to think of it as a whole planet and planetary resources rather than these are Australia's resources, these are India's resources? And that would sort of then stop this worry about immigration so much and start the conversations about actually the whole planet. Because at the minute we have stateless individuals and we have an increase in refugees. And like I spoke about last time, we've got the prospect of, you know, 200 million refugees by 2050 because of climate change. So perhaps there needs to be people leading the way now in terms of changing the way of thinking of the planet. Just a thought.
That sounds pretty good to me, but I'm not sure how ready people might be to take that leap
But I think, you know, we're much happier to recommend people in other countries reduce their birth rate than recommend that we reduce our own birth rate. So I think we're already halfway there.
Except Australia has reduced its birth rate, as has, or not quite as much as Europe and Japan, but
Are we under 2 now, Peter? We were.
yeah, we're 1.9.
For a while there.
We're still 1.9
Right.
in the most recent statistics, which is from the 2016 census.
Right.
However, given ongoing, or perhaps they're no longer ongoing, but with increases in life expectancy, you can have the population stable level is about 1.9, because while life expectancy continues to increase, in fact, the people's great-great-great-grandparents are still alive. So until we have an end to increases in life expectancy, the stable population birth rate is less than 2. Once life expectancy ceases to increase, then the birth rate will be just over 2. The stable population birth rate will be just over 2.
I've not come across that in anything I've been reading.
You haven't read what I've read, so that's certainly
Obviously.
What's in the literature. Yeah.
So I'm happy if you send me some links to that so I can have a read.
Yeah. So that young fellow in Hawaii, you know, who did just looking at Pacific populations and the destruction of the reefs, he noticed that the only places where reefs weren't being damaged was where people were having less than 2 children. So yeah. However, it looks like the increases in life expectancy have now plateaued.
Pretty much. Yeah. For
some
upper class people, yes. Northerners.
Has it plateaued in Australia?
I think not. I think we've seen it in UK and in white Americans, but I think other groups, we still, you know, every year our life expectancy increases.
But there are questions as to whether that's due to neoliberalism and privatisation of healthcare systems, and indeed deterioration of public healthcare systems, as to whether we're plateauing and whether it's actually a biological thing in that, you know, we should be plateauing, or whether it's a sociological thing in that we actually shouldn't be, but we are enforcing that upon ourselves.
Sure, but what we're talking about is not why people are living longer, but that they're living longer, which is what determines the number of people who are alive.
And there will be a ceiling at some stage beyond which the human organism will not be able to relatively naturally go. And so whether that's, you know, 86 or 92 or 105, in different scenarios we may get there. But yes, so I think there are 2 factors at play here. There is the fact that wealthy people in particular are living longer because that's what happens when you're wealthy. But as wealth disparities, even in the northern countries, increase, then there is a feedback that might actually be artificially lowering the longevity point as well. So it's probably another one of these balancing things.
You're talking about the average kind of longevity. Is
yes.
that what you mean, Peter? Yeah.
We are indeed. Just coming back to the advocacy for progression, this idea of focus on earthlings and net carrying capacity. I had an idea that came out of that which I've forgotten. But can you say what you said again, Leah? Lee?
Yeah, if I can remember it. Essentially, we're moving towards a planetary health theme in general, in terms of looking at the whole planet, the ecosystems and everything else in respect to the health of the whole planet. And obviously at the minute we're very hung up on this is my land, this is your land, people are moving here, people are moving there. And actually if we start to try and move the discourse, and it's not going to be an overnight thing, of course not, but somebody needs to be the leader in saying, you know, actually there are things that are bigger here, there are things that are bigger than the UK, bigger than Australia, there are things, you know, as survival as a planet, and starting to move that discourse towards we are all earthlings, we're all sharing this planet, there are stateless individuals, there is an increase in refugees, and that crisis is set to grow. And we as a planet need to now start working together and overcoming these issues, or we're all going to die.
That's right. So is there, yeah, the bit I'd lost was the, on a planetary scale, migration, is net neutral.
Yeah.
But then my response to
the planet, but there are different parts of the planet which will support more people locally, so it depends how global you think things are.
yeah, so I think it is that balance between, it is still the distribution of the people on the planet, so that will be important. So if you've got too many people in a relatively ecologically poor area, then they're going to exceed carrying capacity. And so there is this question about their ability to move for a whole lot of reasons to an area of high carrying capacity. So yeah, maybe it doesn't entirely negate the migration.
I mean, it's probably something that could be brought up, I think, but I think still retaining a focus on Australia is probably relevant. And also, if you take a really big leap, I think people, well, it depends who's reading the policy anyway, I guess, or what we want to do with it. But people just switch off, I think, if you leap too far.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it needs to be the starts of a discourse rather than a straight on, let's all be one planet. And in the words of John Lennon, live as one. That is a bit of a leap. But I think the discourse in all seriousness needs to start happening, to start to open people's minds to that. And I think that very much at the moment, the discourse is very much, this land is my land, that land is your land. And, you know, there are people on lands that just aren't sustainable, like the Pacific Islands.
Well, we only have one atmosphere, don't we? We all share that, so.
Exactly. And we all share a planet. And I think we need to start opening minds to this idea, particularly in the context of climate disruption and the fact that a lot of places are going to go underwater, like we talked about last time. And it might
I think it's worthwhile talking about that planetary view, but not letting it be all that, if you know what I mean. I think we need to stick with the more local as well.
We made a decision early on to think about sustainable population for Australia because taking on the global question at a PHAA level became quite difficult.
We could have an introductory sentence though, couldn't you, to open that?
Yeah, but I think working then through the World Federation of Public Health Associations, if every country had a sustainable population for that country policy, it would de facto become a planetary. Yeah, I think, okay, we've got about, I don't know, 10 minutes left before 9:30, and I'm thinking we should probably wind up at 9:30 in Eastern Australian summertime. One thing that I've been thinking about but haven't quite known whether it's worth talking about is the livability of cities. So ideas of, what we've noticed because infrastructure hasn't kept up with historical immigration, that cities are much more crowded, they're much more livable. But even if we do get to that point where we're building the infrastructure in advance of the people coming, which is Alan Tudge's line, do we actually want to have 40 million people living in Sydney and 50 million people living in Melbourne and 20 million people living in Newcastle? I mean, is that actually a sort of a question? What would it be like? Just imagine going down to Bondi Beach on a Sunday afternoon. Well,
I think I'd be more worried about was there enough water to drink.
Well, that's right. And so
those really basic life needs.
Yeah. I mean, yes, you can look at the issues now, I say, around Sydney with, people mining and drilling and saying, what's happening to the actual catchment area and has the environmental, assessments actually been properly done and conducted. And so, I mean, whether they'd get to 20 million is maybe another thing. But I suppose there's someone, I suppose that sort of still comes up with the population, the resources, the carrying capacity and and things, you know, how are you going to, especially in Australia, even if the East Coast isn't as dry as Broken Hill, there's obviously still going to be a limit in terms of, well, how are you going to get the really basic things for water and food if they, in, you know, the Sydney farms, 90% of Sydney's food actually comes from the farms just nearby. So that's the other thing, you know, it's, you know, that sort of also goes in their carrying capacity and resources, and, you know, the idea, well, we could have lots more, but yes, then we just have to bring all the food from, I don't know, somewhere in Queensland or something. And you've got those issues of, you know, in terms of transport and affecting all the other, you know, areas.
Within Australia, there seems to be this thought of everybody heading towards the big cities. Now, there's a lot. I mean, I live up in Cairns, and there is a huge space along the coast, really, where there could be development for an increasing population. Say, for example, between here and Townsville, which is a good 4-hour drive. Now, there's some small places in between. But the problem is as well, it's not really a problem. Problem is the wrong word, and it is definitely the inappropriate word. But there are discussions then to be had with the traditional owners of the land in terms of, you know, developing further on that land for an increased population coming to Australia. Australia has the geographical space. There's lots of unused land, for want of a better term, like I say, even just here up in far north Queensland. But it's about the culturally appropriate use of that land and the traditional owners of the land, amongst many other things as well. But that one's a big one that springs to mind for me, is further development on land.
But there's also things like, you know, needing to chop down rainforests, and that lack of biodiversity that we mentioned. If we filled all that space up with humans, that's what has to go. So I think there's a lot of, you know, complex issues in all of that.
Yeah, because I mean, historically we've done that, you know, well, there's another patch of forest, let's go and knock it down and build houses. And I mean, that's what's happened to Sydney farmland.
And I suppose for me at any rate, they're maintaining, you know, what forest we have is a pretty crucial thing, because I don't think we've really got this carbon drawdown worked out very well. And the only thing that I can think of that definitely works is forests. So I think we have to be very careful about that, you know, looking after that resource.
I completely agree. It's, I suppose my main argument was just that argument against everybody being down in Sydney or Melbourne. You know, there are other options, but you know, there does come a point, like Peter said, in terms of looking locally, where we say, you know, well, we've reached our carrying capacity and that we can't knock down any more trees, we can't squeeze any more people into the cities, so it's done. But on a planetary level, that's a very final thing to say, and there's a lot of people who are going to be without homes, so it's about striking a balance, isn't it?
Well, it's about having a plan, I think. That's the purpose of the policy, is to have the conversation to lead to a plan. I mean, Dick Smith's, he talks all the time about talking to developers, and developers saying, you know, he says developers are always telling him, no, there's no limit. We could get 50 million people into Sydney. We just need to go up. And there seems to be this logical disconnect between their view of what it might be living. I mean, let's pick 20 million people, not 40 million people in Sydney, with, you know, desalination plants churning out the water, gardens on rooftops, active gardening in the walls, hydroponics, rafts and rafts of artificially growing food off the coast. You know, people have these weird ideas about how we can feed that number of people in Sydney. And, you know, 20 million in Newcastle and the whole coast between here and Cooktown, totally suburbanised. When do we get to a point where, as a species, we say, actually, we don't want to live in a place like that? You know, is there a livability factor in this? I mean, we might be technically or technologically able to do it, but I think there's a deeper question: do we want to do it?
I mean, I know, at least in sort of, I don't know, New South Wales, maybe Victoria, you know, the idea of the Evo city. So it was, you know, Orange and Wagga, and I've forgotten which other ones, maybe Tamworth and Bathurst and sort of places where people could move to in theory and still have a nice, you know, a lifestyle, and at least for Orange and Bathurst, say, and not be too far from Sydney if you really wanted to go there. And of course that would rely hopefully on improving public transport, so you wouldn't just have everyone driving to Sydney whenever and clogging, you know, more roads. So I mean, I suppose that's been tried. I don't know how, you know, and obviously I'm sure it worked in some areas, and then there've been little villages, you know, sort of come to our abandoned house, you can have it for $1 sort of thing. But of course, you know, if a family moves there, then they've got to be prepared to, you know, go, well, what are we going to actually do now we're here in terms of work and you know, sort of those sorts of things. But I mean, I suppose they've been tried, so I don't know overall how successful people say they've been, whether there's still this idea about decentralisation, especially for migrants, but it depends, I suppose, on what migrants and what they're going to get out of it. For medical people, yes, you can get sent to the country because they're probably, you know, well, we need, you know, we'll need sort of health professionals, but I don't know about sort of what other sort of, you know, professionals and other, you know, professions are actually needed, you know, who could move to somewhere and make a, you know, make a life for themselves and not find them going, well, what am I going to do now I'm here?
Yes. I mean, one of the small ironies is that the consequence of neoliberalism and what was called economic rationalism early on is when they shut the banks and the and all these small businesses in country towns because they were inefficient, and centralised them all into big country towns. And of course, the population followed the jobs. And what they're actually trying to do is artificially reverse that without having the infrastructure there to permit it to happen. So that's really a comment rather than a question. But I think yes, this idea of big Australia, 20 million people, floating trees, gardens, tree change, suburbia from, you know, the mountains to the sea. Really, the answer is this, you know, everything of it's not just do people want to live, is that going to be amenable living, but what happens to the forest and the trees and the biodiversity and the other animals. You know, possums and magpies and currawongs will love it, cockroaches will love it, but biodiversity,
But I guess the fact that people continue to come at increasing numbers even shows that no matter how unappealing we might find it, it's still better than where people are coming from. And in terms of a just system, we've got no right to keep them out. Just for our, you know, it's like a NIMBY response. We don't want you, go home. But if they want to come, we've got no right to stop them.
I love that term. Sorry, Rosalie, NIMBY. It's one of my favourites.
And I guess
well,
that goes.
It's a fundamentally difficult ethical question about, you know, whether you can, whether a country, well, under what circumstances a country can say, no, actually, look, our ecosystem is falling apart here. If we let another 100,000 of you people in, we're over the edge and we all go down the tube. Can you say that?
I think realistically though, Peter, at some point in the not too distant future, every country is legitimately going to be able to say that. We're all reaching breaking point here, especially with an influx of refugee migrants, you know, displaced people. So there is going to come a point where every country could legitimately say that. But ethically, I don't think we can, because what are we going to do? Condemn these people to go and sit in the sea and just essentially die?
Well, but see, that's where it's, I mean, I don't have an answer. But you could equally put the ethical point of view that if we put, you know, Australia's ecosystem down the tube and we all die, have we actually helped anybody? The net benefit isn't actually very good. So I guess the only answer to this I can see is we actually need to not get there. We need to work on what can we do now to recognise that there will be population shifts consequent to global change and other environmental damage, and plan.
At a UN type level, is that what you're thinking, or is it?
Well, yeah, the UN unfortunately is been hamstrung by the United States. They're not allowed to talk about population anymore. They're not even allowed to talk about birth control anymore.
I didn't know that. Wow. Could you send me the literature that you read on that, Peter? Because that's a blind spot for me, clearly. A bit staggered.
I don't have my instant recall of where that literature is, but if you go...
Just read the newspaper. Just in the newspaper, Trump's stopped funding any organisation that's got anything to do with contraception.
As did George Bush.
I knew from Trump, but I didn't know that it spilled over to the UN, was my point.
Well, no, I think because the UN documents are as they are, they have to be signed off by governments. Governments who don't want this stuff in there will refuse to sign off on things. So there was some stuff I was reading about the Cairo Declaration, and it was recently redone. And when I was reading it through, because I read the original 1992, I think it was Cairo statement or whatever it was called, and then I was reading the updated one, and all these words had disappeared. They just weren't in there. And other than that, it's stuff that I've heard around the traps, but you know, without actually having a reference to pin it to.
I don't think, like going back to that earlier point about earthlings and so on, and thinking planetary. I mean, I think it is worthwhile making these points, but then honing in on whatever it is we decide is sort of appropriate at the more local kind of national or whatever level we think is appropriate. Because, I mean, if there are 200 million, you know, environmental, well, and other refugees, then it is a global issue, isn't it, obviously? So,
and clearly, as somebody said, we do have some ethical responsibility to playing our part.
Yes. So I suppose, you know, Australia's pretty fragile ecosystem would be, you know, I'm sort of into all that stuff. So, you know, I'd be worried about totally destroying what's already getting a hammering. Because I think your point about, well, if you destroy a place that supports any life, well, that's it. Then you're finished. So have you helped anybody or anything?
So I guess
I think it is good to start with the big picture, those big comments, as you say, to try and open the discourse a little bit, a bit of thinking about what it means planetary wise, but then to hone down a bit more.
Yeah, so I think from a PHA policy point of view, this is the global situation, this is the Australian situation. Therefore, in the Australian situation, this is what PHA is thinking.
I would think is a reasonable kind of approach. Yeah.
I mean, the existing policy sort of does that, which is good because that means that's on the right track. And I think the asks from the policy will be around, okay, let's see this train coming. Let's start planning for it and having the conversation now so we're not playing more catch up down the track.
But I do think on the sort of planetary earthlings kind of note, I completely agree, by the way. I'm certainly not arguing the toss with you at all. I completely agree that at the moment we have to work within the societies and systems that we have. So honing in on Australia is vitally important. But I do think that certainly at the end of the policy, there needs to be some points basically explicitly saying we need to start thinking wider than this. We need to start thinking on a planetary level and just plant that seed. And even if we don't go any further than that, just plant the seed explicitly so people aren't in any doubt of the fact that we can't keep on looking down a narrow track. We need to be opening out and working globally. And of course that's challenging with, as we know, people like Trump being in power.
Yep. And I guess it also means that it links very closely to this idea of promoting planetary boundaries, of promoting a safe climate, because the less climate change there is, the more likely we're going to be able to manage it. And so it really does come down to we need to manage the population as one of these sort of 3 or 4 different factors: consumption, safe climate, living within planetary boundaries. Stop putting chemicals that we don't know what they do into the environment that will be, again, feeding into either birth rates of us or other species, or resource renewal, and just be more careful overall.
And I think at the point where we can have an impact, there's still unmet needs for contraception in Australia and globally. And I think that we can use our, as clinicians, we can make sure that people who aren't planning pregnancy have contraception. We can advocate for good sex education, and both in Australia and in our international relations. I think, that's really at the cutting edge. It's how many people are born.
Yeah. And it also ties into overseas aid, as in we're trying to prevent some of the stresses and the conflict and the crises that are happening that are driving people to want to come here and not stay home. I mean, but Bhagat made the point that, people would prefer to stay home. They only go when they really have to go.
And
I think that bringing in all that stuff is really important, because it's definitely a major part of health as well. You know what I mean? Like, we're health people, and it's a major thing that health can, assist with or do, as opposed to some of the other ideas which are incredibly important, but maybe not quite so directly linked to the health sector.
Yep.
And the other point that is that the threshold between refugees and other migrants, it's a smooth curve. There's not like we have to assess people and say you're a refugee and you're not, but actually in reality it's a continuum that people leave because they're going to a better life, and whether that's economic migrants or refugees, it's just on a continuum.
Yes.
I think I've just been reading recently a little bit of UN type documents around refugees and things, and I sort of got the sense that perhaps there is a bit of a shift in the language being used in that direction, because the definition of a refugee was very, very specific about being persecuted, but obviously there are a lot of people in need who have other issues apart from being persecuted by other humans. So that seemed to be becoming a trend, I thought.
Jill, I just completed a great online course, which I think you'd like, on those lines. It's with Future, called Why We Migrate.
Yeah.
It's only like $80. It's not a lot of money, but it's really interesting, and it covers all of that sort of blurring of the lines. And yeah, you'd like it, I think.
That sounds interesting.
All right, I'm reluctant to wind up, but it's just gone 9:32 in Canberra. So I might wind us up there if that's okay.
Can I just say, Peter, I think this is wonderful. I wouldn't feel like we need to have more than 4 people. I very much appreciate, and I hope that you feel adequately appreciated. In fact, having the small group increases the value, because we've all got a good opportunity to be heard. So please don't feel discouraged because there's only 4 people.
Okay, I won't feel discouraged because there was only 4 people.
And we move on to the next one.
But I totally agree. Having a smaller number means the conversation is more like a conversation.
I think that we do need to consider the next one, though, because I don't believe we have anyone lined up for the next one, Peter. So if anybody's wanting to be the next speaker, I did the first one. Obviously, Peter's done this one.
And that also leads to timing. Do we have time to do one before Christmas, or should we go for February as the next one?
I think one in November would be really nice, but that's just me personally.
What about that piece in today's Lancet? Some of the writers in that, Selena Lowe or one of those people, even if it's not in the PHAA, so that letter in the Lancet about Australia's appalling climate change policies.
Yep. Oh, I mean, Fiona could come online and give us a talk at a drop of a hat, I would think.
Yep. Why don't we invite her?
Or we could invite Tony Cape on, but yes, Fiona's more likely to give us a lively and.
Obviously, we want her to have something that it's new. you know, sometimes can be a bit repetitive, but she might have
Yeah.
something exciting and new.
Yeah,
I mean, if we're going to frame it as the call on the Australian government, I mean, she would talk about the National Strategy for Climate, Health and Wellbeing. I guess it would give us the opportunity, because in a way, I mean, the current Australian government's a bit of an anomaly. And although they're going to try and destroy as much as they can before they get voted out of office in May, because they recognise they're probably going to get voted out of office in May, it might be around practicalities of getting a national strategy up and what we could do, because that's probably what Fiona would more likely to want to talk about.
I think it's a good idea.
All right, I'll ask her. Do we have a date in May?
November.
November?
The election's in May, you reckon?
Well, I don't know what ScoMo's thinking.
I need to have a look at the calendar and see when that is.
So if we go for the last week of November, that's somewhere around...
29th is the last Thursday.
Yep, I've got a meeting that night, a meeting the night before, a meeting the night before that, a meeting the night before that. So that's not a good night for me, a week for me.
I've got us down as the 22nd, Peter, in my calendar for the next webinar.
2nd of...
22nd of November.
22nd of November. Oh, okay. Yeah, all right, let's go for the 22nd of November.
Works for me.
Yeah, no, that'll be okay.
Is that a Thursday?
That's a Thursday, yes.
But not the last one.
No, the one before the last one.
I had a clash tonight, that's why I was late. I had a clash every last Thursday.
All right. 22, 11. All right, I'll get on to that anon. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming and for your input and the conversations and the ideas. Hopefully somewhere early in the new year, we'll get a bit of a draft background paper out for comments. And then a bit after that, a draft, actually the background paper might come out even sooner. The plan is to get this background paper done, get it into the journal, the Australian New Zealand Journal, and then write a policy based off that. So that hopefully is going to happen quite soon. In other news, there's a paper gone into the Australian New Zealand Journal of Public Health based on the health impacts of waste incineration. And the idea is to come up with a policy next year on waste incineration, because it's something we keep getting talked about or asked to talk about, and we don't really have a position statement. So this paper and policy, if we can get it done, give us something to say sensibly. Does anyone know anybody who would know anything about well enough to be a reviewer of a paper on the health impacts of waste incineration, just because the journal is having great difficulty finding reviewers? If you
What about the waste arena as opposed to the health arena?
Maybe
well,
Dan Ewald, who knows a lot about coal pollution, coal air pollution.
okay.
And he's a person who'd look it up if he didn't know.
He would. Okay, I'll float that idea into the system. In a way, because I'm one of the authors, it should be sort of blind. But I guess if they're desperate, that's just going to have to be the way it is, because otherwise it might not get published, and that'll just be a shame.
I've got an article with BMC Health Services Research, and it's open reviewer, and I just Google the people who are reviewing my paper, and it's quite a different feeling.
Yeah, that's true.
One's in South Africa and one's in Greece.
Right.
And so when I found that out, I changed my terminology to kind of match what they might think about Aboriginal people.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, I'll put forward Ben's name as well. See what they think.
There probably are journals of waste, you know.
Yeah, well, there's toxicology, there's chemisphere, the International Journal of Environmental Health Research and Policy does some stuff in this space. So I mean, basically, I went through it's a literature review. So I went through all the journals that were in the reference.
Right out of the health space. Are there?
Well, the problem is that it's about and health. So if they're out of the health space.
Yeah, but there might be some crossover, you know what I mean? If you're looking for people who might know about it, maybe in the waste, environmental waste kind of, whatever their database is, I wouldn't have a clue, you know, the equivalent of PubMed, whatever they use.
Science Direct,
and then there would be, you know, a few articles, I'd imagine, where they stray into the health arena.
Yeah, I mean, I think the students I had writing this, they found there was a lot of veterinary stuff, which may or may not have been useful, but wasn't human. And then there's a lot of stuff on waste, but it doesn't have a health thing. And one of the reasons why this article is worth publishing is because there's not a lot that's tied together on waste, incineration, and health. There's different bits of it. All right, Leah, your battery's gone. Okay. The battery just died. She's left us. Okay, well, thank you for that.
Okay.
And we'll catch you on the 22nd and by email in the meantime. Thank you.